In this video, I'm going to explain what test-driven development is. Hello everyone and welcome back. In this video, we will be discussing a topic that's very dear to my heart and almost an unconscious practice at this point. And that is the test-driven development, short for TDD. A while back, I came across a book that's called TDD, The Testing Goat. What an incredible name for a book, right? Anyways, this book talks about test-driven development, which has completely changed my methodology on how I approach coding technical features from scratch. And it has definitely got me to write better code. So what is this test-driven development? Test-driven development, or TDD, is a software development approach in which test cases are developed to specify and validate what code will do before even a single line of code is ever written. If you haven't done any TDD before, or if you're used to the conventional method of writing code and then writing the tests for them, you probably already are or will be very confused. Because how could someone even write tests for something that doesn't even exist? And that's a fair point. So actually writing tests for code that doesn't exist yet is probably the whole point of this TDD thing. The process works as follows. You write tests that will obviously fail because there's no code written for them yet. Then you write only enough code to make these tests pass without paying too much attention to other areas of your feature. Then once that code that you wrote gets these tests to pass, you write more tests that will again fail. You then write more code, enough only to make these tests pass. And you keep on repeating that process over and over again until you have your required functionality coded out. This incremental process is what is known as TDD, or test-driven development. It's also a very systematic approach which, in my experience and the experience of many others, massively reduces the amount of production bugs. And it massively reduces the amount of coding monkey brain syndrome. And yes, that's a term I just came up with. This coding monkey brain syndrome is a thing that we all go through when our thoughts are scattered and all over the place. This sort of makes us feel like we missed something. Do you know that feeling? However, if at this point you're still feeling confused, I got you. As always, I was racking my brain trying to find the perfect analogy to simplify this process for you guys. But I couldn't find one that actually makes sense to me on my own. So I did what any dignified software engineer would do in this case and started scouring the internet for blog posts that would help me with this task. And this is when I came across this article. In this article, the person who wrote it claims that he got offered a job just out of explaining this TDD analogy to his non-coding lawyer friend over some tacos. This job offer apparently came from some random person nearby who was eavesdropping into their conversation. Now, I don't know how much of that is actually true. Probably none of it, because no one would ever actually hire you just off of one good analogy. But his analogy is actually quite great, so I will use it for the purpose of this discussion. And I will leave a link to the original article in the description if you want to check it out. So he starts off by asking his friend the following. If a restaurant owner were to ask you to create something that people can drink from, how would you go about creating that? And the answer to that is that you could follow one of the two following routes. So route number one, you could go through the traditional design cycle, where you basically design a bunch of sketches and objects that can hold liquid and has an opening which people can drink from. Then you show these sketches to the client. You and the client pick a few, and then you create prototypes for these few selected sketches. However, at some point you could possibly realize that your prototype is actually too expensive to build in reality. So you go back and you try other designs. You show these to the client once more and make a few prototypes and changes to these prototypes. But then you also realize that there are other problems that also exist along in the new designs, and then the process repeats itself again and again and again. In this process, you are making an entire single unit of a design process, so making even small changes is not really feasible. Or in software terms, this process is not really agile enough, which, just an FYI, is a real requirement when it comes to software production in general. You can't really keep track of the elements that were successful and the elements that weren't in each of these designs, just because of the sheer amount of factors that go into just making one prototype. From things like that the prototype needs to be waterproof, for example, to that it should be able to hold a good amount of a liquid. It shouldn't be too heavy, it should be easy to wash, it should be easy to make, it's cheap, durable, and so on, and the list goes on and on. I think you and I can probably agree that there must be a better way to approach this, and this is not very optimal. And luckily there actually is. And this brings us to route number two, or the TDD approach. So what you do is you turn these requirements into sort of tests, or in its simplest form, yes or no questions. This in software would translate into success or fail tests. You check in with the client to see if there's anything in those tests that you hadn't thought about initially. So for every test, you sketch or brainstorm something that will only pass the tests, or in software terms, you just write enough code to pass the test in this case. For example, you need it to be waterproof, then use something like glass. You need it to be easy to wash, then make it something that is simple shape. It needs to be durable, okay, make its walls thick. And so on until all your tests pass and the product finally emerges. You then have a documented process of everything you've included in your design, and you feel organized and in control of the process at all times. So no coding monkey brain syndrome. Unlike in route number one, the secret here that instead of replacing your prototype with a completely new design or prototype each and every single time, you just gradually evolve it. And the fact that this is a creative endeavor, you might find yourself making a few different versions of the product, each passing all the tests, which then you show to the client. Together, you and the client can refine and mix things up, all the while checking that your changes haven't led to any tests failing, thus knowing that you still have a good working product. Now, this is awesome for obvious reasons, but there is more. When this same client comes back to you in 2 months to ask for another liquid container, but this time it's geared towards hot drinks, you have a template of tests to start from. You just need to add extra ones for the heat-resistant ones, and you're good to go. This makes you confident in the fact that your entire design is still okay by simply running the tests, for example. And finally, one more thing to add: when someone takes over your role and they're asked to improve on the liquid container that you built, they know exactly what you were thinking and they can go from there. Or when, for example, in software terms, when a new developer is onboarded to the team, they will be able to look at the tests that you wrote and understand what your logic was or how you were thinking about this as you were coding it out. Now, there's a more powerful variation of this TDD approach, and this is both what I use on a daily basis and what the TDD testing codebook recommends. And this involves the following. Step number 1. You write an integration test, which, if you don't know, is a test that tests your functionality from start to finish. And of course, this test will initially fail, because remember, that's the whole point. Step number 2, which is to start breaking these tests into smaller tests that are called unit tests. Unit tests are tests that only test a single unit or the smallest unit of intended functionality of our step number 1. So you just write one unit test at a time and then you go to step number 3. Again, this test is also going to fail. Step number 3. You write only enough code to make the test that you wrote in step number 2 pass, and don't worry about anything else. This finally brings us to step number 4, which is to repeat steps 2 and 3 until the tests in step number 1 passes. This is single-handedly the most important coding technique you will ever learn, because it allows you to have a documented process of everything you've included in your design, and you feel organized and in control of the process at all times. I hope this was helpful in helping you understand what test-driven development is, and I hope I've inspired you to try it for yourself, because I think it's absolutely amazing. If you've enjoyed this content, hit that subscribe button to get notified when I release a new video. That being said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.